it's a story I've never told before until I wrote this book. I never shared it. I start with how I gave a sandwich to a homeless woman outside of Grand Central Station. And in fact, yes, I did that. And it was an impetus for me to do more. And I began bringing sandwiches with my two sons into New York City. But the real start for the organization, or what propelled me forward to want to help in some way, was the untimely death of my mother. So that kind of tragedy, it just really impacts you. It left a hole in my heart. I immediately felt, that I wanted to do something to help people. And so I began just reaching out in my neighborhood. And, before my mother's death, I didn't have any of those thoughts. It was just,
Yeah.
Carefree and playing with my friends and so on. But I really felt compelled to help others because I knew what hurt was, and I didn't want anyone else to hurt.
Let me introduce you properly. This is In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer, and I am Frank Schaeffer, and my guest today is Karen Olson. And Karen is founder and CEO Emeritus of Family Promise, a national nonprofit organization that has trained and mobilized over 1 million volunteers over the past 30 years to provide services to the homeless and to homeless families in particular. Karen was the recipient of the 1992 Annual Points of Light Award from President George H.W. Bush, and is the author of Meant for More, Following Your Heart and Finding Your Purpose, which I just finished reading this morning, and I have notes that I'm going to be asking you about here when we get into talking about your work. In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer is what you're listening to, and I would just ask you to please subscribe now on YouTube, and also to In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer on Apple Podcasts, and to my Substack. It has to be said at frankschaeffer.substack.com. Okay, that all the boilerplate out of the way. Let's talk about your book here for a minute. When did this book, Meant for More, Following Your Heart and Finding Your Purpose, when was it published?
Just a month ago.
Yeah, that's what I thought. So it's basically new. And I finished reading it, and I just want to read something from the book. Let me see where it's from.
Okay.
It's from page 63, 64, which I thought set it up well. If I was going to be designing a cover for a book, sometimes they put a long quote from the book on the back. This is the one I would have picked, and you can correct me if you don't feel this sums it up. But anyway, here you are writing about what you have done, and you put it this way: there is always something we can do to extend a helping hand to others, no matter what the specifics of our circumstances and others might be. It feels good to people when we express empathy and compassion. Sometimes that is enough for them to make changes in their lives. In the grand scheme of things, our kindness can ignite a spark of hope, a beacon of faith in their otherwise challenging existence. Through these seemingly small gestures, we contribute to the more significant effort of reintegrating people in need into the fabric of society, reinforcing the belief in their ability to reclaim control over their lives and confidently navigate toward a better future. Over the years, I have met so many people and heard so many stories on the healing impact of kindness, compassion, and caring for others that in the remainder of the book, I have chosen to share some of their stories with you, interwoven with my own anecdotes. And I felt that really summed up what your book is about and what you're about and what your story is about.
Yes, I agree.
Before we get into it.
I agree. It does. It's a good summary.
Thank you. Well, I enjoyed the book very much and was moved by it. And we'll get into some of the individual stories, but let's sort of go back. And I've got some quotes here, but I'd rather have you tell us about it. The beginning of your book, you're talking about your mother and your own journey through childhood, young adulthood, and the kind of things you faced there, which I think shaped you, as you put it in the book, not just as childhood shapes all of us, but very much in particular, to be prepared to reach out to people in empathy, kind of understanding, the suffering that people go through, because you yourself faced some fairly early hardships. So rather than reading passages from the book, let me just ask you about your childhood, your parents, that part of your life that you talk about in the book. And let's start there, if you don't mind.
Okay, yeah, that's fine. Well, it's a story I've never told before until I wrote this book. I never shared it. I start with how I gave a sandwich to a homeless woman outside of Grand Central Station. And in fact, yes, I did that. And it was an impetus for me to do more. And I began bringing sandwiches with my two sons into New York City. And so I would start it there when I would have speaking engagements. But the real start with the organization, or what propelled me forward to want to help in some way, was the untimely and horrific death of my mother. She committed suicide when I was just 12. And I was very, very close to her, not so close to my father. My dad was an alcoholic, and I had a 2-year-old sister. So that kind of tragedy, it just really impacts you. It left a hole in my heart. And, I immediately felt, that I wanted to do something to help people. And so I began just reaching out in my neighborhood. And I was a candy striper at the hospital. And, before my mother's death, I didn't have any of those thoughts. It was just, carefree and playing with my friends and so on. But I really felt compelled to help others because I knew what hurt was, and I didn't want anyone else to hurt. So, in all that pain, if you want to call it this, was a hidden blessing in that it propelled me forward. I don't mean just, oh, I would like to do this, or I would like to become a nurse. I mean, it was a feeling of being propelled. I must do this. And so I wanted to become a nurse, but my father had remarried, and the stepmother had been a nurse. And she said to me, I was a nurse. You'll never be a nurse. You don't have what it takes. And so she persuaded my dad not to send me to nursing school. So that dream was shattered. But I also realized that when one door is closed, God allows another door to open. In other words, had I become a nurse, maybe if I was lucky or skilled enough, perhaps I'd be in charge of a floor, But instead of becoming a nurse, all that energy to want to help was used to create this national organization that now has 200 affiliates and have helped over 1 million men, women, and children. That was really the impetus to start the organization. But I've never shared that, but I thought, I'll share it in this book because I think other people could relate to that.
Yeah, as you cast your back to the circumstances that led your mom to that point in her life, you talk in the book, you have a passage which I think I've got here that I can read below, but again, I'd rather hear from you, where you're kind of noticing something about her one day that really gets your attention. You don't know what's about to happen, but you don't exactly have a premonition of something, but you see something in her demeanor that worries you. And I'm wondering if you look back now as an adult who's lived this life of helping people, obviously with helping people who have been homeless, you have been in contact with a lot of people who probably have considered taking their own lives and maybe have tried to sometimes. And I wonder if you look back at your mother's circumstances, if there had been some adults around who understood her circumstances better, do you think she could have been helped, or was this kind of an inevitability? I don't know what you picked up as a child and what you remember, but I'm curious what you think about that now, having helped so many people probably not commit suicide.
Yeah, well, I think she could have been helped. That was back in 1956 when people really didn't see psychiatrists or psychologists, or, they did, but to a lesser degree.
Yeah.
And, no one was helping her. She went to her, her medical doctor, and that was about it.
Yeah. Let me get to something in the book that kind of sets up what you did there. Again, this is very early in the book. 38 years ago, I embarked on a personal mission to offer families of children experiencing homelessness a place to stay and support of various kinds to meet their needs for shelter and stabilization. My intention to be of service and to uplift people going through hard times attracted many individuals in my local community, and our success subsequently led to the creation of a nationwide movement, an organization that is still going strong today. And I just wanted to zero in on that part, the still going strong today part, and get an update from you about, before we get into the dynamic of how you started everything and people's stories, to bring us up to speed on the present day, because we read a lot in the media about homelessness, various cities on the West Coast in particular that seem inundated with communities living on the street. It's become a political issue that gets kicked around in terms of criticizing people who are too liberal or people who are too harsh, whatever. I'm not going to go there right now, but what's the present state of the organization that you started in terms of this expanding problem? And as of right now, what's the situation? How are things working out?
Well, one thing, Family Promise now has a very strong homelessness prevention program where if someone's about to be homeless, they help with paying back rent, they help with family reunification, they have a case manager because it's much better, of course, the family can stay in their own house. So we do a lot with prevention services, but our affiliates also have gone on to develop housing, affordable housing. Many units of affordable housing have been created. So the organization has grown to offer other services, job training, car donation programs, tutoring, all those kinds of things. And the reason for that is you start a program like what I started was a rotational program where each church, synagogue, or temple could provide shelter for a week at a time in rotation with other congregations. So the typical religious congregation did this about once a quarter. But what grew out of that, you involve, say, 50 volunteers in each congregation or people who want to go above and beyond. Some have employed people in their own companies. They've offered them job training, rehearsed for job interviews. So much more has come out of Family Promise. Mainly, the magic is the ability to engage volunteers at the local level.
Yeah, I when we got on together here, my producer was on with us before he signed off and we went live. But Ernie Gregg, who produces this show, and he and I have been working together for 7 or 8 years now on various projects. His church, his husband Rock, and he are involved in a church that work with part of your program. And so he was very excited to get you on because your program had given a structure to what they were doing in terms of their own outreach. So we have a bit of a connection with what you have done with this. I want to double back on the story a little bit and get something a little earlier in the narrative. This is, I think, from page 21. And I wanted you to expand on this because, yes, you talk about that faraway look in your mother's eyes. What did you say? While my mother was always physically present, that faraway gaze suggested she was there, but not really there, which I thought was a wonderful way to put that. But moving forward, after you've gone to live with somebody else, I'd like you to just unpack this a little bit for us and explain this bit of the story. Feeling incredibly lonely and longing for the comfort my mother had provided, I mustered up the courage to ask Charlotte, and I'll ask you in a minute to tell us who that is, if I could join her while she watched TV in her room. I wanted only a sliver of love. I love that, by the way. Lovely line. A sliver of love and comfort. She generally gave Carol. Again, you'll need to explain what this story is. She left the room and returned with a straight back chair, placing it off to the side where I could still see the television, but she didn't allow me to be in a position to receive the same warmth and love she gave my sister. So what is all that about? I know because I've read the book, but I'd like you to tell us.
Well, when my mother was alive, we always watched television together. We'd
Mm.
sit together on the sofa, and I leaned my head against her shoulder
Yeah.
and watch TV. And it was always very comforting and just a special time. It was nothing extraordinary, but I knew I was loved and accepted.
Mm.
So after my mother died, we hired a housekeeper to take care of my sister in the house and so on. And so Charlotte, I went into her room and hoping to, watch television with her.
Yeah.
And I said, can I lay down on your bed? It was a small room, and she had a comfortable chair, and there was a bed.
Yeah.
And she said, I don't want you, girl, to wallow on my bed,
Yeah.
Um, and then that's when she got the straight back chair.
Yeah.
And so, a straight back chair is such a symbol of being cold, anyhow,
Yeah.
a straight back wooden chair. So I left and went back into the living room and continued to watch television by myself because my dad was always usually out.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah. And I just find these things very touching and moving because, the energy that you put into making sure that other people, in a way, don't have that loneliness or suffer those indignities. And, you've done something with this, but I just want people to know that when you read this book, as everyone should, um, the context of the reaching out that Karen has done is the suffering she experienced as a child herself and as a young adult. And you have another passage that says it's like this: crushed when my father and stepmother shut the door on my decision to attend nursing school, which you mentioned earlier. I made a hard pivot. I studied hard and acquired an associate's degree in business administration, which set me on a slightly different path. I was confident that something ahead of me would allow me to serve others regardless of the field. I was wired to help others. And I kind of love not just the wired to help others, but as you look back, you realize that, as you kind of mentioned briefly earlier while we were talking, that the closed doors, the things that did not work out that you had planned, kind of opened new ones. And you ascribe that to kind of, I guess, God's plan or God's leading, which brings me to sort of an overarching question for you, if you want to go there. And that's one of faith. My own faith journey is I grew up in an evangelical fundamentalist mission in the 1950s and 60s. I left that. I have rejected, if you want to put it that way, the faith in which I was brought up. I'm no longer part of that, and we went even further in that my parents became very important in the religious right back in the 70s and the early 80s, and I have spent a long time trying to undo some of the damage I think we did. But I'm really interested in people's individual spiritual journeys. So I guess working back from where you are now, I kind of describe myself somewhat facetiously as an atheist who believes in God. In other words, a bit perplexed, and certainly not someone who would throw around the same language that I was raised on. But on the other hand, I have tremendous respect and love for people like, for instance, my producer, Ernie, who's working in a church. I'm not trying to convince anybody to become more secular or whatever. So I'm just interested if I might pin you down on where your journey stands right now. How do you see yourself in terms of faith? And I know, how does that relate to the work you started to do, but also just in your own life? Because I think that, it's legitimate to ask that, because the book is infused with actions of mercy and kindness and rooted in the Christian tradition, as I guess you would understand it.
Right. Well, I'm not a member of any church, and I haven't been for a long time. I grew up Presbyterian in Darien, Connecticut, and the church that we see more like the atmosphere of a country club, where it was prim and proper. And I never felt that I found God there. In fact, where I found God when I was a child and after mother died was on a rock on the side of our house, a big rock about 5 feet by 4 feet. And it was shaped as a heart. And actually, there was a hole, I remember now, right in that rock, a hole in the heart. And that's where I used to pray. And I would plant, not daffodils, some daffodils, but violets and other flowers from the woods. I would dig them up and plant. And that's where I would pray, because being in nature connected me to God, So, yeah, I would say my spirituality is not a religion. It's just, I believe there is a God, an energy, a universal energy that's all love. And I believe that you can tap into it. And I certainly consider myself more spiritual than religious. I'm not religious, but it's interesting to note that through my work, 6,000 religious congregations have gotten involved. And I've done a lot of speaking at different congregations. So that's what I really wanted too. I mean, I got two things that I really wanted. I was able to help homeless families. I was able to engage religious congregations in this mission and this work of service and advocacy as well. So that even though I'm not a member, I was glad that I was able to involve so many that they could put, faith into action. So I don't know if that explains.
Yeah,
where
that's
I
a great
am.
answer. That's exactly what I was hoping for. I want to just mention that I'm talking to Karen, who has written this book that I've just finished reading, and I'm going through some of my notes here. It's called Meant for More, Following Your Heart and Finding Your Purpose. And Karen has founded this amazing, you wouldn't call it a ministry. What do you, it's a nonprofit charity, but how do you actually describe it? I mean, I know what it does. What's that?
It's a nonprofit organization serving families who are experiencing homelessness.
Yeah, and it operates on a very big scale. And by coincidence, my producer is part of a church that works as thousands of churches do with this project. I want to go to a quote here that I think is important in the way you look at life. It seems to me it represents the way you see things, but also just as a kind of a pivotal hinge moment in the story. Then one particular day in November 1981, fate intervened. I was on my way to a business meeting on Lexington Avenue when my eyes rested on a withered homeless woman wearing a cap over her gray hair, appearing to be in her 70s. She was perched on a worn crate in front of the bustling Grand Central Station. Two weather-beaten bags, brimming with her life's possessions, were nestled at her side. So I wonder if you could go unpack that for us, explain what that led to, because that was one of the big moments in your life where things changed and you focused on things a different way. So perhaps you could tell us a little more about that.
Well, I had a corporate career in marketing, and I'm working for Warner Lambert and going into New York City frequently for meetings. And I was about to pass this woman who appeared to be homeless out in front of Grand Central Station. And I had seen her before, but just on impulse, I darted across the street and bought her a ham and cheese sandwich and an orange juice. And when I came back, I gave her the bag and the juice. And she said, "Thank you, God bless you. I haven't eaten since yesterday." And I stayed there and I talked with her. And she lifted her hand up to mine, and I took her hand in mine. And it was just a pivotal moment, like where I had crossed an invisible line, because I really hadn't stopped to talk to people who were homeless, let alone take their hand. And there was so much warmth in her hand. And we ended up talking, and she told me a little bit about her life. She had been married. She was a mother, but her husband, who was a chef, died, and she was left homeless when the little savings they had ran out. And so if you go back, you could see Millie sort of more in the mainstream, but here she was, forgotten and alone. And that just touched my heart. And I told her a little bit about my life. And now, time was running by and I had to get to my meeting. And so, I said goodbye, God bless you. And she said the same. But what transpired after that is I told my two sons, Brad and Doug, who were then 10 and 12, about Millie. And they said, let's go into New York and find other people like Millie. So we began every other Sunday going into the city with sandwiches and giving them to people. And we soon saw that people in Port Authority that were sitting on the benches were not waiting for their bus. They were simply homeless. In other words, Port Authority was a building that drew people who were homeless.
Sure.
And they were there. So that's what our ministry, so to speak, was. We would go to Port Authority all the time, and we get to know people and know their names. And some would say, well, we hope we see you. But we just would, and I really needed the sandwich as a vehicle to say I cared,
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, we met Arthur, who was this frail man who had medals inside his jacket from World War II, and John, who was an amputee, and Louise and Lucille, who said she was the first grade teacher, but now she lived under the escalator with belongings all around her and a little kitten in her bag. So we got to hear their stories, and these were people. They didn't look like us, in other words, because they were in shabby clothing, but behind the shabby clothing were people with a heart who were hurting. And so then we took it further. At Thanksgiving time, I bought bus tickets and gave them out with invitations to our house for Thanksgiving dinner. And the men and a couple of women would take the bus into Summit, the Lakeland bus, and we would pick them up with some help from the neighbors. And then we'd have Thanksgiving dinner and with the neighbors and our homeless friends from New York City. And at that point, at different times, I would say, Karen, you're crazy. You don't do these things, But then the other part of me, which is a more spiritual side, I'd say, and I'd say I'm living more in spirit at that time and now, certainly, is of course you should do this, And so I did, and I couldn't tell at that point if I was crazy doing this or what. Crazy doing this would be if I looked at my barometer as what the neighbors would think. But actually the neighbors were helping me cook the dinner and so on. So, and then at Christmas time, we'd have Christmas at my house, and my kid's dad would come, and we'd have Christmas presents, and then we would go to Port Authority and deliver Christmas gifts, and were wrapped, clothes and wallets and scarves. And then from there, we got hugs and God bless you. And then from there, we go to my father's house, where we would have more lavish gifts and so on.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. And you had kind of unintentionally started something.
Yeah. Started something, was growing, but it wasn't the Family Promise program yet. It was just, I was doing one thing after another. And then I began volunteering in my county of Union County, New Jersey, and met families who were experiencing homelessness. Yeah.
Yeah, there's a passage sorry, go ahead.
I have the tea. I'm sorry.
Yeah, there's a passage in the book that is it talks about attitudes toward seeing people, which obviously you and your sons moved way past. You say, we often feel conflicted when a homeless person approaches us, though we may be willing to give some change or even a few dollars for a meal. We second guess ourselves and wonder if they will use the money to buy alcohol or drugs. When we see a young person begging, we ask ourselves, why can't they get a job? We hesitate, feeling uncomfortable about giving or not giving them something. And these mixed feelings come to the fore every time we hear the word homeless. Unfortunately, the stereotyped perceptions of what homelessness is in our society are reinforced by how people experiencing homelessness are portrayed in the programs we watch on television and in films. And I think that really brings up a good point. I'm guessing that often you look at something in a movie or a play or a film, and you wish that they could dive into your book maybe and pull a story out of one of the people you talk about and actually portray someone not as a bit part on the side of the road with a bottle or something that the star stumbles over as they walk down a sidewalk, but really get into their story. It must be frustrating to you.
Yes, it is, because you see people who are obviously homeless because of how they look and their clothes, or maybe they're pushing a shopping cart or sleeping in a subway grate, but you don't see homeless families or kids, and homeless families account for about 35% for all those who are homeless, and you see the homeless families, but yet you don't see them. For instance, if you go by the McDonald's window and you get your order from a woman who says, well, have a wonderful day, and you say thank you and drive away. You don't know it, but she could be homeless and living in her car with her child. So you don't see homeless families, but people do see the chronically homeless. And that's the problem, is most people, even well-educated people, equate homelessness with the stereotypical homeless person as opposed to families.
Yeah, you say before long a mission began to form inside me. I wanted to find ways to provide safe shelter to the homeless families in my community. So let's just take a minute and talk about, here you are with your sons, and they're little, they're 10 years old and such. And now, you move forward and you have this sense of mission. So this is, your book tells part of this story, but just give us a thumbnail of how, what happened between, these first encounters, learning people's names, inviting them home for meals and so forth, and then kind of move forward to this sense of mission that began to form in you. It's one thing to get an idea like that. It's a whole different thing to raise the funds and the people and get the interest going. So, without, being too subtle about it, obviously you are a formidable organizer and an inspirational person, because the difficulty of starting and doing what you've done is immense. And I want to just ask you a little bit about the nuts and bolts and mechanics of how you did that. Okay. What were the steps that took us from there to here?
Well, again, I began volunteering in New Jersey, and that's where I saw homeless families and talked to them, got to know their stories. And I thought, does the religious community know? And I wanted to turn to the religious community for two reasons. One, they had the people and the buildings that could help. And also I thought that it would be good for religious congregations, because it would allow them to live out their faith. So I thought the first step had to be awareness. How was I to educate, like in my community of Summit, most people, or many people, commute into New York City. So they see the chronically homeless and think that's homelessness. So I planned a conference on family homelessness and invited the religious community, and 200 people came in 1985, October of 1985, to an all-day conference on family homelessness. And Bob Hayes, who was a founder of the National Coalition for the Homeless, came and spoke. And some folks who were homeless spoke, and providers and so on. But then that provided awareness for the religious community, and the 200 people were there. So I didn't want it to be just a wonderful educational conference and everybody leave, and that was the end of that. So I planned a meeting 2 weeks later, invited people to come to that meeting. And then I met with that group of about 30 people at first, and then went down. to, a handful or more, but
Yeah.
that's all we needed. And so we began looking for a building, but there were lots of red tape issues, there were zoning issues and NIMBY issues, and not one church or synagogue could provide space in their building for a full-time shelter.
Yeah.
So I asked the religious community, I asked the people if they could take turns a week at a time in rotation with each other. That would mean the typical religious congregation would do their sheltering about once a quarter, and that became very, very doable. More than that, they loved it. They opened their doors, and in a lot of congregations, it's very hard to get volunteers for anything, but we had an outpouring of volunteers, more than we needed. And that said to me, there's people are very compassionate and are frustrated and want to make a difference. They just don't know how. So this was a perfect vehicle. That meant volunteers could come in and cook a meal and have dinner with their families. They could read stories to the children. They could stay overnight. They could bring their own kids to volunteer. So it was a wonderful family environment. So that's how it started.
Yeah, and you were able to probably tell them how you had involved your own son serendipitously.
Yes.
Before you really, you talk a little bit about the more formal beginning. You say, when the Interfaith Hospitality Network program began on October 26, 1986 at Christ Church in Summit, New Jersey, we converted classrooms into bedrooms, provided home-cooked meals for the families, and had compassionate volunteers on hand who made sure that every guest was treated with care and respect. We knew in advance that we would also need to provide a place for the families to go during the day, because we didn't want to be like other shelters and turn them away after breakfast, leaving them to wander the streets. Has that, what you talk about there on page 54, has that model continued? Is that basically also going on now at all these various places? Is that same more or less form that has continued since 86?
Yeah. Yes, that's true. That's a core model. But unfortunately, with COVID, a number of congregations stopped the rotational program, and they found one facility. So now about half of our affiliates do the rotational model, and the other half have a static site with volunteers.
I want to dive into a change track here a little bit and just ask you a question about something. But before I do, I just want to mention the title of the book again. We're talking about a book that Karen has written, and it's on this journey, her own personal journey through her mother's suicide, her own suffering as a child, the doors that she opened in her mind in terms of empathy and compassion to others, and how these played out serendipitously in the lives of other people, involving her own young sons at an early age, long before she had an idea on making this into something. But one of the ways you tell us the story of how this happened as individual stories. I can't dive into them all here. They're all worth reading. So I'm just going to pick one. I'm going to ask you to tell Mary's story as a token of many stories, and I'll read one passage and then ask you to flesh this out, tell us what this is about. Volunteering may initially seem daunting in a world characterized by ever-busy lifestyles, work commitments, and family obligations. Yet, as Mary Ryan's story in the following pages illustrates, giving can result in various unexpected and enriching rewards. After an abrupt loss of her eyesight due to diabetes, Mary, instead of wallowing in her circumstances, transcended her adversity to nurture 26 newborns and infants. So touching, over nearly 2 decades. So let's talk about that.
Yeah,
we can't do them all, but let's talk about Mary.
She's an amazing woman, and is volunteers with us today. But how she started was, from taking care of foster babies. She said, I may not be able to see, but I know how to change a diaper, feed a baby, and so on. So it's amazing what she did, helping so many foster babies. And she went on to do other things as well, including volunteering for Family Promise. But, she's just an amazing volunteer. And I would hope that people would read her story and say, well, gee, if Mary Ryan can take care of all these babies, I can do something. she's just an amazing, amazing woman.
Yeah, and all the stories in the book all add up to sort of a novelistic good read. But of course,
Hmm.
the point, because you tell them well, but the point of them is to take us somewhere else. And I guess, again, I wouldn't say this is the heart of the book's message, because who am I to tell you that? But I think that this little passage I'm going to read at some length, I guess I would sum up as, look, okay, what can we learn from this book? Why read this book, aside from it's a good book and it'll touch you and inspire you to do more for more people? But here's a good passage, I think, that sums up some of that. Small acts of kindness can impact and influence how we view others. Time and again, guests of the Family Promise program have commented, excuse me, on how surprised they were by the goodwill of the volunteers, people who didn't even know them, but were willing to be welcoming, friendly, and helpful. People struggling with a lack of self-worth or feeling rejected by their family and friends can feel uplifted and valued, whether giving back to others to reciprocate what has been done for you or simply because you feel it's necessary or right. Kindness to a stranger is a powerful gesture for good. The truth is that all of us need help at some point. The thing to remember is that when we feel alone, there is always someone willing to extend a hand to us, and it may come from the most unexpected person or place. Although accepting help can be humbling, it's all right to let yourself be supported, because someday you can pay it forward to someone else. We need each other. The support we receive from others can bring us hope for a life healthy, whole, and happy again, perhaps in ways that are better than we ever imagined. And, I love that passage of the book, but I also think it's the reason to read it, because if you can be inspired to actually live a little closer to that code, one thing I found in my life, and I want to ask you about if you feel the same, is that, I think people underestimate also how much a gift it is to ask someone for help. As a father and grandfather, the happiest moment of my life is when a granddaughter texts me and says, I need something. Okay, I'm on it. I can do something for you. Or somebody you meet and just wants to stand there and tell you their story. And then you see them a week later and you go by and they ask you for something. I feel that some of the moments when I feel most alive and most joyful are when I've been asked by someone to do something, and it makes you feel like, okay, that's why I got up this morning.
Hmm.
And I
Yeah,
felt that reading that passage.
right. Well, there's a volunteer in our program. His name is Pace, and he was a chemical engineer for Sandia Labs. And one day he was driving along, and there had been a heavy snowstorm, and he saw that this car was stranded. So he parked and he went over, he knocked on the window, and he asked what she needed. And her tire, she had a flat tire.
Hmm.
So he changed her flat tire. And this woman, Alice, was so grateful for that. And then a couple months later, Pace was going to be transferred from Sandia Labs in that location to another location.
Hmm.
And so his colleagues are throwing him a going away party. And as he recalls, there were people that got up and spoke, and they were just suits. But about midway through the celebration of Pace,
Hmm.
Alice got up and said, you know, he stopped and he changed my tire, and it meant so much to me.
Hmm.
And sharing that story meant so much to Pace that he opened his heart a little more. And then Family Promise came to his congregation, and he was very busy. He said he only had time for work, church, and family,
Hmm.
but this was something he could do. So he began to volunteer in
Hmm.
Family Promise, cooking breakfast, playing with the kids, and so on and so forth. Then he saw that they needed a full-time coordinator. So he said, well, I'm good at organizing, I'll do that. And then he got more and more involved. And then he asked the families back to his house, and they have a zip line in the backyard. So the families would go on the zip line. It was just a small way to, face their fears. And he got more and more involved. And, what he says, is Family Promise gave me a more expansive heart. And his congregation right now is not doing the Family Promise program, but he still continues to help people with HIV. There's a neighbor next door who's disabled. He helps the neighbor. So in other words, it's really interesting. Family Promise opened that door, or changing Alice's tire opened that door to his heart, which maybe had to take a back seat because he only had time for work and family and church. But it made him come alive. So obviously volunteering made him feel very, very good.
Yeah. My producer, Ernie, has a question for you that he passed on to me in the chat section. He says, we have a homeless problem, but we also have what he put in quotes, a placeless problem. What has Karen found as helpful for reintegrating people into a more expansive and inclusive society? That obviously has got to be part of what you do. And I think, it's a good question. So how would you see that? What does Family Promise do? And what is your view on the possibility of reintegrating people, and what can be done about that?
Well, it depends upon if we're talking about the chronically homeless or families. I'll start with families. At Family Promise, we help families find housing, and we have an 82% success rate in placing families in housing. But that's not all that we do. We stay with the family for sometimes up to 2 years by providing support, case management, or volunteers who support families. They have a house, but they may be underemployed or have health issues. So support continues to be needed. As far as the chronically homeless, we have in Summit, we have an affluent community. We actually have 20 people who are experiencing homelessness. And so we have a task force that's working individually with the families to help them find housing. But again, that's a community response. I don't have an easy answer for that. But when you have community, tonight, we're taking out to dinner. One of my aides and I are taking Ed out to dinner tonight. It's his birthday, and he's homeless and has been homeless for about 5 years. And we're working with him to help him find housing. But even the small act of celebrating his birthday, I know, means a lot. And I got him a phone, and it's all wrapped up, but I'd gotten him a phone before and a number, and it was stolen. So now I have another phone to give him. And I know last year when we took him out for his birthday, and everyone in the restaurant began to join in and singing happy birthday to Ed. And he put the cake down. He said, for me, big smiles. So, this is a very caring man, and he reads very positive books in the library. He goes to the library and sits and reads books, and so everybody's working with him in this task force to help him find housing, and then the community will come around him.
Two terms I'd like you to help me clarify. You talk about the chronically homeless being one thing, and then families another. And then with families, you have a very high percentage rate of helping them move back into some form of housing. Just loosely, how would you define chronically homeless as opposed to the families? Because you talk about them as if there's a difference in their prospects. And just curious on the terminology.
Well, oftentimes people who are chronically homeless have no support system, and they're more apt to have substance abuse or mental health issues, and have no support network. And so those are what we call more chronically homeless. People do come out of being chronically homeless. It takes a lot of support and motivation on the part of the person experiencing homelessness.
Yeah, and the families, I guess, it's a situation that is more temporary in the sense that they find themselves there, but not perhaps because of various mental illness issues or substance abuse. It's a bit of a difference, and so and they just things have not worked out. Is that more true of that
Well,
situation?
yeah, that's true. It can be they lost a job or they became ill, and they got behind in their rent. Like Hope is a woman who's profiled in our book. She was fine until one day she experienced an illness where she couldn't see, and she went to the doctor, and the doctor said she had a virus that she probably caught from her daughter. And so when she had the virus, she couldn't see, she couldn't drive to work, she couldn't hold a job, lost money, and ended up being homeless. Fortunately, she found Family Promise, but it's often a situation that people experience that causes them to be homeless. It's not. It's the root cause is the lack of affordable housing,
Sure.
but there can be many precipitating causes.
Yeah.
Loss of a job, an illness, a divorce, an eviction, and so on.
Yeah. Let me ask you in wrapping this up, first of all, I just want to thank you so much for your time and mention once again to everybody that Meant for More is a wonderful book. It tells a big story of one person, that's Karen, but it tells a big story of a work, an outreach that obviously is incredibly important, can't be overstated. Meant for More, following your heart and finding your purpose, divided into a narrative, personal story of Karen's, and then the stories she tells of other people. I do hope you buy the book and read it. Let me just wind up by saying, when you wrote the book and you tell stories in that you hadn't told before, for instance, sharing the tragedy of your mother's suicide, when you look at the results you hope from the book, people reading it and getting involved with something related to what you're doing, that their own hearts are moved, like the story you told about the gentleman who helped somebody change a tire and it kind of changed his life. What would you like to see come out of the book itself in terms of people reading it, reaction to it, and how that might affect what you're doing as you move into the future, still involved with the work you do? How do these two things fit together? What would you like to see happen?
To see that people are kinder to each other and reach out to their neighbors, whether somebody is sick next to you and you bring a warm dinner, or you just are, offer somebody who's standing in line for a cup of coffee, you buy their coffee, that sort of thing. It can be very small acts of kindness, or it can be more. But I would hope that people would experience the joy of service and want to do more. It's all about wanting to create a more caring society. And what you find out is, when you reach out, is that it makes you feel good and you want to do more and more. And if we had more caring communities across this country, problems would be solved and people would be better off.
Yeah, well, thank you for writing a book that says all that and more. And I found it very inspiring, and I hope people do read it. And thank you for your work. And thanks to your assistant, Jennifer, who we haven't seen except when we were not here, but I think helped you out a little bit as we've been going.
Tremendously. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Frank.
Yeah, my pleasure. Now,
Enjoyed speaking
do
with
me a
you.
favor. When
Yes.
I sign off here, don't you and Jennifer click off, because if you could spend a moment with Ernie, I'd ask you a favor, and that is, if you know of other people we ought to interview, either from the work you do, or someone that you and Jennifer work with that could tell more of this story, keep us posted, or perhaps is in some totally different field, doesn't need to be an author or anything like that. But if you pass on a guest or two's name to us that we could contact, we're always grateful, because we're always looking for someone to interview. And I would particularly value your direction, because we definitely want to not just help what you're doing, but also just continue in that mode of shining a light on kindness and empathy and the importance of it in all of our lives. So if you think of any guests that we should be talking to, would you please stay a moment and talk to Ernie about that?
Yes, and be happy to do that. More than
Yeah.
happy.
Well, listen,
Very
it's been
nice.
a real privilege talking to you, Karen, and
And
I
to you,
loved your
Frank.
book. Thank you for writing something that really moved me.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Okay.
Bye.